Well, welcome. It's good to see you. So just going to look at God's word for those who have been coming along. We've been working our way through 1 Timothy. Well, I've certainly been working my way through 1 Timothy. Dad has been working his way through 1 Corinthians. And it was announced on the WhatsApp group that it was 1 Timothy 4. I thought I'd finished 1 Timothy 4, so apologies if you thought there was more to come. But we'll maybe have to go back to it another time. But I thought I was in 1 Timothy chapter 5. So that's where I've been preparing. So you're getting 1 Timothy chapter 5. And if you thought there was more to get from 1 Timothy chapter 4, which I'm sure there would be, then maybe you'll just need to do your own studying and glean it for yourself. But yeah, 1 Timothy chapter 5. And as I was just praying there, I suppose historically, wasn't it, when we had kind of ministry meetings, we didn't really, well, I suppose the last few years we've been doing kind of systematic teaching through the Bible. So we're just working our way through various books, which kind of started over the course of lockdown, and we've just kind of continued it. We've looked at various books of the Bible. I suppose prior to that, it was really a kind of a bit of an ad hoc, wasn't it? It was just kind of where you were reading at the time or where you had maybe an exercise. But when you're kind of doing through a book through kind of systematically from the beginning to the end, you've just got to deal with it all, haven't you? And I suppose 1 Timothy chapter 5, the majority of it's possibly not a chapter that you would really think about spending a great deal of time on. A lot of it maybe on the surface would seem to be kind of quite irrelevant. The bulk of the chapter is all about the church's care for widows and our responsibility to them, and I suppose not only the responsibility of the church to widows, but the responsibility of family to widows, and the criteria, etc., that Paul said that the widows must meet in order to be those that would be the recipients of financial help from the church. So it's a different culture from what we're living in today. The New Testament, the culture when Paul wrote to Timothy was different. They certainly didn't have the same kind of financial support that we get in our country, certainly. They don't get benefits, they don't get pensions, they didn't have any kind of financial support. So a woman who was a widow indeed was a very vulnerable member of society and a very vulnerable member of the church. And Paul emphasised that, and the responsibility the church had to look after widows, people that were financially vulnerable. And I suppose there's a sense in which we don't have that same experience today, and that there is benefits provided by our government. But I think the overarching truth about the fact that we need to take care of vulnerable people who are a part of our fellowship stands true, whether that be financial support or support with our time, our energy, our effort. People are vulnerable in different ways and in different stages, and the church does have a responsibility to minister to those who are vulnerable. But we'll read the verses together, and then we'll just work our way down through the chapter and hopefully learn a few lessons from it. So Paul writes, and the first few verses aren't actually anything to do with widows, but he writes and he says to Timothy, so Timothy, just for a wee bit of background for those that are maybe not familiar with the book of Timothy, Timothy was a young preacher, a young evangelist. He was a young church leader who had been left behind by Paul at a city called Ephesus to try and support the church there. The church had lots of problems. As you can imagine, anything that's new and anything that's just beginning has lots of problems, lots of issues that need to be ironed out, lots of issues that need to be resolved. And Paul, who had been there and had planted that church, had left Timothy behind to kind of try and sort out some of these problems and try and iron out some of the issues that the early church was facing. And, we've moved on 2,000 years, haven't we? But the reality is that there are still problems at times, aren't there? Problems that need to be ironed out, issues that need to be resolved, difficulties that need to be overcome. And interestingly, Derek shared a wee bit about that, didn't he? And his testimony about the church up in the Shetland, where there had been problems that needed to be dealt with, and how there needed to be a resolution to the issues there. And so Timothy's been left with this great responsibility of shepherding the church, looking after the church, nourishing the church, teaching the church, building the church up. And he's a relatively young man at this time. Some reckon anywhere between kind of mid-30s and 40, probably not any older than that. So relatively young, and a big responsibility to kind of shepherd and pastor the church at Ephesus. And Paul writes to him in verse 1 of chapter 5, and he says, "Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. Honour widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now, she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith, and he is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she's brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides this, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honour, especially those who labour in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the labourer is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against an elder, except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels, that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. Do not lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. Some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. Likewise, the good works of some are clearly evident, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. And we do know that God always blesses his word as we read it publicly and share it together. So the first opening verses here are Paul speaking to Timothy and giving him instruction about, and over this little couple of verses, I just wrote the idea of relationship. So he says, do not rebuke an elder. It says in the kind of King James Version, do not rebuke an older man, it says in the New King James that we've read from. So certainly the idea that Paul is speaking also in the idea of scriptures, we've got those who are elders, and we looked at that previously in the previous chapters. Timothy had been part of Timothy's role when he was there at Ephesus was to appoint elders. And elders are people in the church who have a position of leadership, a responsibility to lead the church, a responsibility to shepherd the church, a responsibility to feed the church, to nurture the church. And Paul has already given Timothy instruction as to the characteristics that ought to mark these types of individuals who are in positions of leadership, elders in the church. When we come to chapter 5, verse 1, Paul is not so much referring to an elder as being a person who is in a position of leadership, but rather he is just talking about an older man. So remember, Timothy's a young man, relatively young man, as I say, anywhere between maybe 35 and 40. So a young man, and Paul instructs him, he says, don't rebuke an older man. Don't rebuke someone who's more advanced in age. And I suppose the idea is really to have that kind of respect, a respect for the older generation. And you know, I suppose Timothy, with the responsibility Timothy has as a church leader, and more no doubt possibly a man filled with kind of enthusiasm, youthful enthusiasm maybe, that there is the tendency that they are a bit disrespectful to an older generation, a generation who has lived longer than them, a generation that is more experienced than him, a generation that is wiser than him, because we know that the years, don't they, more years we have, then the wiser the more life experience people have. And I suppose the danger was that for a young man like Timothy coming in was that Timothy was overbearing, overpowering, and disrespectful to the older generation. And Paul is warning him that he ought not to rebuke an older man. And I suppose that there's a sense in which, on the surface of that, we can all take lessons, aren't there? You know, we live, don't we, by and large, in a society that sadly disrespects the older generation. They fail to appreciate the life experience that the older people among us have got. They fail to experience that life experience has given them wisdom that far exceeds our own. And there's a generation that perhaps growing up that thinks that the older generation has got nothing to offer. And Paul is warning us against that. Paul is teaching us that we ought to be respectful. We ought to give consideration to those who are older. And I think it would do us all well. And, you know, I think of my children respecting me, which I think is only right, isn't it? But then that's got to, you know, I've then got to respect my parents and when they were alive, grandparents and older people in the church. We've got a responsibility to respect them and to hold them up with high regard and to appreciate what we can from what they have gained over the years of their lives. So he says, don't rebuke an elder, don't rebuke an older man. You know, Timothy later on is going to be instructed that there is times when someone needs to be rebuked. We read about that at the end of the chapter, didn't we? We read about an elder, and when we read about the elders at the end of the chapter, just to confuse you, they are church leaders. They are people in positions of leadership. So he says, in that case, if they're guilty of sin, then Timothy has been encouraged to rebuke them. Paul will write to Titus as well. He was another young pastor, young minister, a young shepherd of God's people, and he too was exhorted in 1 Timothy chapter 2 that he was to rebuke people in the congregation who were guilty of sin. So, you know, Paul is not saying that the role of the pastor, the role of the shepherd, the role of the elder is not to rebuke ever. But the word here actually for rebuke in verse 1 of chapter 5 is to do it kind of harshly. It's to do it berating people. And Paul says, look, don't berate. Don't speak harshly. Don't be disrespectful to the older generation. He says, treat them rather as a father. Treat them as a father. Exhort him as a father. Encourage him as a father. You know, that word exhortation, you know, we've all been watching, haven't we, over the course of, well, we maybe haven't been watching, but it's been on the television, whether we've watched it or not, the Olympics. And you've got your Olympians out there, haven't you? But in the background, you've got the people that have spent their months and years in the lead up to those events, training up those athletes to give their best. And part of their responsibility, part of their role is that they exhort, is that they encourage the athletes to do their best, to give their best, to achieve their best. And these individuals that stand on the sidelines, not the ones out there in the public eye, but the ones who are in the background, and their job has been over the months is to encourage and exhort these athletes to achieve what they can achieve. And, you know, that is really what Paul is saying to Timothy here. He's saying, don't speak harshly. Don't berate the older generation, but exhort them, encourage them, spur them on, give them the encouragement they need to make the successes in life that they need to make. Be an encourager. Be an encourager. And, you know, it's far greater, isn't it, to be an encourager than to be someone that berates and harshly speaks against people. You know, how many churches have faced problems because of the way that someone has spoken to someone else in a harsh, condescending, berating manner, when Paul was encouraging us rather that we should be those who are marked by that encouraging spirit. Remember Barnabas, one of the early church leaders, remember, son of encouragement. That was what marked his whole life. You know, Derek was talking to us earlier on about gifts, about the gifts that we have. You know, surely if anyone had the gift of encouragement, it was Barnabas. Barnabas, it was just the encourager. the one that would just draw alongside, the one that would just speak up on the behalf of people, the one who would just try and spur people on to be the best that they could be. And so, we need to be marked by that same spirit of exhortation. Exhort him as a father. And again, it's just this idea of not only respect, but it's this idea of relationship, isn't it? When we come together, then, we're brought into the family of God. And there's a sense in which I know that we're brothers and sisters. Paul writes that repeatedly in the various church letters that he writes, doesn't he? He refers to them as his brothers and sisters. And, Derek again, sorry for just keeping it back to the previous message, but Derek again was reminding us of that, wasn't it? That I hope all, there's a room filled with his brothers and sisters. And we at Auchinleck, it's our brothers and sisters. That's what becoming a Christian does. It brings us into a new family, doesn't it? It brings us into relationship with one another. We share the same Father. We have God, and therefore we're brothers and sisters. And all those that are here this afternoon and all those that have been here and have gone, if we're born again Christians, if we have the same Father, then we're in a family relationship with one another. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. And is that not a remarkable thing? I think it's remarkable. You think of the diversity of individuals that we've seen over the last few months in this room. We think of our African brothers and sisters that we've fellowshipped with and shared time with. We think of our Indian brothers and sisters that we've spent time with in recent weeks. And we're brothers and sisters in Christ. Regardless of our cultural background, regardless of where we've come from geographically, regardless of the colour of our skin, regardless of our accent, regardless of the way in which we conduct ourselves in our culture, we're brothers and sisters in Christ. And it's an amazing thing to be part of God's family. And so we're that family. And so Paul is reminding Timothy that, the people that you're in fellowship with are your family. They're your brothers and sisters. And look upon the older ones as your fathers, the ones that you look to for guidance, the ones that you look to for support, the one that you can draw wisdom from. That's what you need to see in your older men and your older women. Treat them as your mothers. That kind of same natural bond that we have with our natural parents about, and all that we've gleaned from that, the benefits we've gleaned from mothers that have cared for us, nurtured us, loved us. He says the women in the church, the older women in the church, they're your mothers. They're your mothers. Maybe you're here, maybe your experience of a natural mother maybe isn't that great. I know sometimes we speak from a very one-sided point of view. We speak from our own experience, and obviously I was blessed in my upbringing and the relationship I had with my mum and her care and her concern and her love. But I appreciate that's not everyone's experience. But when we come into God's family, your single mum that you had naturally is replicated, duplicated, and you've got older women in the church that are your mothers that can care for you like a mother cares for her child. So look at them in such a way. And your younger men, then they're your brothers. Treat them like that. I was thinking about that. I don't know how you treated your brother growing up. I know how certainly my sons at the moment treat their brothers, and I suppose maybe the behaviour that was seen in the home was replicated in the church. Maybe I shouldn't encourage them to treat them the way they treat their brothers, but we should. There is that, and I know that every family bickers, don't they? Every family has their occasions when they don't see eye to eye. That's just life, isn't it? When everyone's grown up in a relatively small space, and we all don't get on all the time, do we? But I know at the end of the day that I've got 4 boys at home that if it came to the nitty-gritty, they would come together. You know what I mean? They would stand by one another. I trust. But that's what it is. We have to see our Christian brothers, as our brothers, and the younger women, we have to see them as our sisters. And then Paul adds this little statement, doesn't he? With all purity. So again, put an emphasis on the purity of the relationship that exists between a young Christian man and young Christian women should be a relationship that is marked by purity. And Paul has already given indication to Timothy about the need to keep himself pure. Later on, he'll write to him about the fact that he needs to flee from youthful lusts. And so as Christians, there's an expectation that we live lives of purity, and particularly in a sexual relation between male and female, the expectation is that they are relationships that are marked by purity. And so he warns Timothy that when he speaks to his sisters, these younger women in the church, that he does so with purity. He does so with purity. That he's not flirtatious. He is not making comments. He is not in any way conducting himself in an impure way towards any of the young women in the church that he's looking after. And, again, we need to be guarded, don't we? The standards of the world are far, far short of that. The standards of the world is you know the world as well as I do. I don't need to get into the details of what's permissible out there, but what's permissible out there is not permissible among the people of God, among people who claim the name of Jesus as their Lord. Their behaviour in a moral way should be completely different from what goes on out there. And so Paul emphasises that with Timothy. He says it needs to be with all purity. And so it's this idea of respecting the generation that is older than us, and drawing from that, their experience, their life learning, their wisdom, and seeing them as fathers and mothers, and seeing the younger ones among us as brothers and sisters, and having that respect and having that relationship with us. And so then Paul writes about this group of individuals that we've been thinking about, these widows, or widows who are really widows. And Paul is going to give us a bit of detail as to the responsibility that the church has towards these individuals. As I said earlier on, these are possibly not verses that you would automatically turn to try and encourage people from the Word of God, but they're there, aren't they? All Scripture is given by inspiration of God. So just as Paul has already dealt with some weightier issues perhaps in the earlier chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, he's talked about church leadership, he's talked about the gospel, he's talked about false teachers and things like that, and things to be aware of. He's talked about the necessity of prayer, the preeminence of prayer. He's talked a bit about the men praying. He's talked a wee bit about leadership. He's talked about how women should conduct themselves, all of these sort of things. But, chapter 5 is there by the inspiration of God, so there are lessons for us to learn about these vulnerable individuals that needed care for by the church. We already indicated, that from a financial point of view, we don't live in the same days. People really shouldn't have the same financial constraints that was experienced by a widow in these days. In these days, if a widow was on her own, she had no husband to provide her with financial support, and she had no family to provide her with financial support. She certainly didn't have a government behind her that was going to provide her with financial support. And therefore, as a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, the responsibility would fall to the church to look after the widows, to look after people that were vulnerable, to look after people that were in need. And, that hasn't changed. It hasn't changed that the church still has a responsibility to look after people who are its own, that are vulnerable and that are in need. And so we have a responsibility to them. He says, honour them, take care of them, provide for them, widows who are widows indeed. But then he says, but not just does the church have a responsibility, he says, actually, the family, if that woman has got family, then that family has got a responsibility. And so he says, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, then let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. So there is a sense in which, there's a responsibility by the church. But Paul is saying, look, but wait a wee minute. If there are people in the family that have got the ability to provide for that person's need, then that is where that need should be getting met. It should be the family. It should be the family. They should be taking care of their own family. And so, as Christians, and I know this is in relation to widows, but the reality is this, that God's expectation of us is that we take care of our family. We take care of our family. We live, sadly, don't we, in a culture where people have become dependent and reliant on the benefit system. And I know that the benefit system is there, and the reason for the benefit system is good, but sadly, it's abused, isn't it? Sadly, there are people who take advantage of it and who are more than capable of working and taking care of their family the way we're intended to do, but they choose not to, and they choose to rely on the benefits that are supplied by our government. As Christians, I believe that if God has given us the ability to work, then it is our responsibility to work. It's our responsibility to take care of our families. It's our responsibility to take care of our families. As dads, particularly perhaps, our responsibility is to work, to make provision for the family that God has given us, to make provision for the wife that God has given us, to make provision for the children that God has given us. Elsewhere in Scripture, Paul will write to Christians, I think it's in Ephesians, and he tells them and reminds them about the fact that they ought to be those who are working, those who are marked by hard work. And, as Christians, we need to have that same mindset, that same attitude, that we ought to be those who care for who is in our families. So it might be parents that we need to care for. And again, excuse me, I appreciate that there may come a stage in people's lives when they're unable to provide that care at home, and I understand that. And I'm no way being critical of people who get to a stage in life where they feel that they need to put their family into a more permanent place of care to look after them. That is entirely acceptable. But what I'm saying is that if with what we have, then we have a responsibility to care for the people that are nearest to us. We have a responsibility to care for our families. We've got a responsibility to care for older parents and grandparents. We've got a responsibility to care for our children. And so the responsibility really falls on us, and so we can't use the church as a means of avoiding that responsibility. And Paul is not going to allow that. Indeed, Paul is going to outline criteria, requirements that these widows must meet before the church will be responsible for looking after them. And so we kind of use the church as a crutch to finance things that God expects us to finance as a family and to look after people as a family. It's a sad reality, isn't it, that people oftentimes see the church as a resource of financial support, of a way of getting things. And I suppose it's always about getting the balance right, isn't it? Someone comes to your door, or someone phones you up with a sob story about how they're I don't know, stranded. They need bus fare to the next town or whatever, or they've no food, and they tug on their heartstrings, and it's getting the balance right, isn't it, about who we've got a responsibility to help and who we actually just need to encourage to help themselves. And I don't know that I know exactly where that balance is, and I know there are people that get far more of those calls than what I get, so I wouldn't like to judge, but there is an expectation of us, isn't there, that if need can be met from within ourselves, and particularly with regards to our family, then we should meet that need. And so there is the responsibility of the church, but there is also the responsibility of the family. In fact, three times over in this little section, Paul reminds us of that. In verse 4, he says, if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. So remember, Paul was writing to Christians here. He's encouraging Timothy to speak. These are the Christians who are in Ephesus. He says, if you've got family, then it's good and acceptable before God that they take care of their family. Verse 8, it says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith, and he's worse than an unbeliever. So it's strong words from Paul, isn't it? For someone that is not going to take the responsibility seriously to either care for their elderly relatives or to care for application's sake to our own family, our wives and our children, he says, if you don't do that, he says, you've denied the faith. He says, you're actually worse than unbelievers. Even the unbelievers know that the expectation is that they should look after their families. And then again in verse 16, before he concludes this little section, he says, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. And so three times over, in three different ways, in a sense, Paul reiterates the truth of this fact that as families that we've got a responsibility to care for one another. I suppose there's a sense, isn't there, in which it's getting the balance. Is where does our faith, interest in our faith end and our family begin? I don't know if I'm saying that particularly well, but it's the idea of where do we invest our time? Do we invest our time in our faith and in activities that our faith calls us to? Or do we invest our time in our families? And I think the Bible teaches that we ought to invest our time in our families. I think of pretty remarkable missionaries and men who accomplish things that I could never accomplish, never dream of accomplishing, and the sacrifices that they made. I remember a few years ago with the kids club, we did David Livingstone. And David Livingstone had a family, and some of that family he never saw. He never saw them in his pursuit of the gospel and in his desire to share the gospel with the people in Africa. And I don't know how you balance that up. I wouldn't like to stand and be critical of a man like David Livingstone for all that he accomplished, but he had kids at home that he never spent any time with. He had kids that never saw their dad. Is that a good reflection of a Christian dad? Is that a good reflection of a Christian husband that goes away and leaves his wife for months, years at a time in his service for God? You know, I think there needs to be a balance, doesn't there, between what we invest into our service for God and what we invest into our families. God has given us families to care for. And, you know, you might be here and, you know, again, we're thinking of the different gifts that we've all got. You know, if God has given us a family, then we've got a responsibility to that family. As a husband to our wives, we've got a responsibility to them. As a dad to our children, or a mum to our children, we've got a responsibility to our families. And we need to rear them in the things of God, and we need to encourage them in the things of God. And so it's getting that balance right. And again, as I say, I wouldn't like to be overly critical of any of these great missionaries who did, you know, take themselves away from their families in order to serve God. But, you know, I think Paul would certainly teach in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that we've got a responsibility to care for our own. And that is more than just sending money to our family and financially supporting them, isn't it? I think it's about being there. I think it's about being the lead in the home that we should be. I think it is about investing the time into our family that we need to. Our family is our mission field. Really, our family is our mission field. And so whether you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe if you're daft enough like me to have 6, or even beyond that, that is our mission field, isn't it? To invest our time into the lives of our children. And so not just to provide for them in a physical way and provide for them financially and make sure they've got clean, you know, school clothes for starting a new term and make sure they've got a decent meal on the table. And these things are important, obviously. But, you know, it's really about investing spiritually into the lives of our children. And so we can draw from this, although Paul is speaking about the responsibility of to elderly people, to widows, is still, I suppose we can apply it to other family members as well. We've got a responsibility to look after them. And if we fail to do that, if we don't provide for our own, then even we're worse than those that are unbelievers. So it's harrowing words, isn't it? And I suppose it's a challenge to us this afternoon. So we've got this relationship that we've thought about in chapter verse 1 and 2. We've got this idea of respecting those that are elders. We've thought a wee bit about the responsibility that we have as a church to care for those that are vulnerable, to care for those that are in need. And we've thought a wee bit about the responsibility that falls on families to take care of one another. And I suppose particularly for parents to look after children. But, you know, going back to the chapter, Paul is obviously referencing here widows. But, you know, Paul is going to outline here for us that there are requirements that need to be met before a widow is liable to receive financial support from the church in the first, in first century church life. There were certain things that ought to characterise her. So verse 3 says that they had to be widows who were really widows. And you might think, well, what does that mean? Well, I suppose he answers that in the next verse, doesn't he? Because the people that he describes in verse 4 had other family members. They had children, they had nephews, they had other people that could provide support. So they weren't really widows indeed, in the sense that, yeah, they might have been alone as far as their husband might have died, but there was other family members there that could provide support. So they weren't widows indeed. The verse 9 gives us some other requirements. Don't let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. So this was obviously a document, wasn't it, that Timothy or someone in the church was to construct, that was going to have a list of all the people that the church was going to take responsibility for looking for. So it was a kind of roll, as you can imagine, a list of names that were going to be added. And he says, this is the criteria that these people need to meet. This is the requirements that need to be met. So they can't have any other family that can provide support for them, because if that's the case, then their family should support them and the church shouldn't be burdened by that. But he says they shouldn't be under 60. So if you're a widow and you were under 60, then you didn't qualify to go on the list that Paul was writing. They had to have been the husband of the wife of one man. Again, a couple of ways that we can interpret that. We thought about that a few months ago when we thought about the requirements for an elder. One of the requirements for an elder was that they would be the husband of one wife. And again, we talked a wee bit about the various ways in which that statement can be interpreted. I think we can take from it certainly at least this, that she had to have been faithful to her husband. So she had to have lived a life of faithfulness to her husband. It could well be that they had, in these days there were more than one wife. So it could well have been that there was she might have been widowed from one, but she might well have still been attached to someone else, and in which case he could support her. But I think certainly from it we can draw this, that she had to have been faithful. She had to have been faithful over the course of her life. What else ought to have marked these people that were going to receive financial support from the church? They had to be well reported for good works. So as people looked over the course of her life, they had to see evidence that she had worked good works in people's lives. She had a life that was marked by good works. Good works. So this list is getting narrower, isn't it? So A, they couldn't have any other family that could support them. They couldn't be under 60. Because Paul gives explanation to that later on. He says, look, if you want to be under 60, chances are you might actually decide to get married again. So, and you're young enough at that stage. I don't know what happens when you're over 60. Obviously, Paul had written you off by that point, so you couldn't remarry after 60. But I suppose his expectation was that if you were under 60, you might be inclined to find another husband. So she's going to be under 60. You have to have been faithful to your husband. You had to have been marked by good works. You had to be someone who had brought up children, and I suppose the sense had brought up children well, I would imagine, brought up children in the fear of the Lord and in the understanding of the Lord, and maybe even not just their own children, but in these days there would have been a lot of children that were orphaned, and so people would take those orphaned children into their home and they would care for them and they would love them and they would nurture them and they would bring them up as their own, I suppose. And so he says if a woman has done that, then she can get her name on the list to be supported by the church. She ought to be someone who has lodged strangers, so who has brought people into her home and given them a roof over their head and put food down on the table in front of them and taken care of them. Paul will write elsewhere, or the Hebrew writer, isn't it, that writes, whether it was Paul or not, up for debate, but he'll talk about the fact that we can minister unto angels unawares when we show hospitality to strangers. So these women had brought folk into their home. They had lodged strangers. They washed the saints' feet. We thought a bit about that earlier on, didn't we? The Lord Jesus washing the feet of the saints. Whether again this was a physical thing, or whether it was a kind of spiritual way in which he'd washed their feet. Again, possibly physical. Dad explained the culture. People would come into your home, their feet would be dusty from the journey that they'd taken. They had open-toed sandals, their feet would have been dirty and dusty, and the host of the home would have taken that menial task, that humble task of getting down and washing the feet of our guests, and that mark of humility. So these individuals, these women, had to be those who were marked by good works. They had to be those who had brought up children well, people that had brought strangers into their home and looked after them, people that had washed the saints' feet, people that had brought relief to the afflicted, and diligently followed every good work, every good work. Now, what an individual, eh? What an individual. These weren't the people, I don't think, that Paul was having pity on because of their predicament in life. These were people that were valued by Paul because they were valuable to the church. They were valuable to the church. You imagine having individuals in your church congregation that fits all this criteria. People that are, apart from being under 60, because we do appreciate the people here today that are over 60. But, apart from that, think of people who have shown that faithfulness throughout their life, who have been a godly example in marriage, who have shown younger couples, giving them something to aspire towards when they see the faithfulness that a woman has shown to a husband over many, many years. Think of having people in the church who have brought their children up and brought their children up well in the fear of the Lord, and not only taking care of their own children, but showing an interest in other people's children. Think of people there in the home who bring people into their home and take care of them and minister to them in humble ways. Think of people who are there and they relieve the afflicted and diligently follow every good work. These were people that had invested time. These were people that had invested effort and care and consideration into the church. And because of that, Paul says, your name can go on the list. We can support you because of all that you've done, because of the value that we see in you. It's not that we pity you for the condition you're in, it's because we value you. It's because we value all that you've poured into the lives of your family. It's because we value what you've poured into the life of the church. And therefore, there is recompense for these individuals, that Paul is willing to support them financially when the time arises, if they've met the requirements that he outlines in these verses. You know, these were women that had invested themselves into other people. These were women that had invested themselves into the church. You know, as I was thinking about these things earlier on, I was just thinking of, you know, the fact of, you know, what are we, when we think about church this afternoon, what is our expectation of church? Is our expectation of church that we'll come to church and we'll take from church what church can give us? Or I wonder this afternoon, when we come together, do we come with a spirit of what are we going to bring to church? What are we going to bring to the gatherings of God's people? Are we people that are takers this afternoon? Or are we individuals that are givers? You know, I remember years ago, a young guy who got saved and became part of the fellowship here, and then over the course of time just started kind of coming along to some of the meetings, and I overheard a conversation. They said, you know, I'm just not getting anything out of it anymore. And the person that was having the conversation said to him, well, what are you bringing? What are you giving? And you know, that's a challenge to all our hearts this afternoon, isn't it? You know, do we come to church with a spirit of what we're going to give to the church? What are we going to bring to the church? You know, Derek's, you spoke to us earlier on about the fact that God has given us all gifts, and that is for the common good, isn't it? You know, I wonder, are we exercising those gifts for the benefit of the church? Do we come with an exercise to give? And I don't just mean giving a public way, like, you know, standing up and praying, you know, and taking part in a public way or anything like that, you know, but just in our interactions with one another. Do we come with a spirit of giving, or have we come with a spirit of taking? You know, these women that were going to meet the criteria that Paul thought necessary before the church would support them were individuals that had given, and kept on giving. And whether that was in their own home, to their own families, or whether that was towards their children, or whether it was towards strangers, or whether it was a menial task of washing people's feet, or whether it was just bringing some sort of relief to the afflicted, these were the people that Paul saw fit to receive financial support from the church. And you know, it's a challenge to us all this afternoon. Would we be willing to do the things that were required of these women? Are we willing to invest ourselves into church life? Are we willing to give and do what we can and use the gift that God has given us for the blessing and for the benefit of others? And so there's these requirements that are listed. You know, earlier on in the chapter, it says here in verse 5, I missed this out by accident, but it says, now she who is really a widow and left alone, so she's got no other support, what's her attitude? I don't think she's necessarily looking for the church to support her. It says this, doesn't it? It says, she's left alone. She trusts in God, and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. Verse 5 of the chapter. So this is not somebody that's out there begging for a handout. This is somebody that's trusting in God. And I suppose maybe trusting that God will place it in the heart of the people of the church, our brothers and sisters, that they'll make provision for her. But ultimately, our trust in God, our trust is not in the church to meet her need. Our trust is in God to meet her need. She trusts God. Even when naturally speaking, things seem so bleak, even when naturally speaking, she might wake up in the morning and think, I've no financial support. I can't go out and work myself. I don't have a husband that works. I don't have sons and daughters. I don't have nephews. I don't have any earthly family that can support me. But I've got God, and I'll trust God. And God won't fail. God never fails, does he? That's a wonderful truth, isn't it? You know, sometimes we lose a sense of trust in God because we do get a bit self-sufficient, don't we? Because I know at the end of the day that I'll go and work 37.5 hours a week, and at the end of the month, I'll get a wage, and a fairly reasonable wage at that. to support me and my family and to have a relatively comfortable life. So there's a sense in which, because I've got that guarantee almost every month, then I think, where's my trust in God? It's probably lacking. I probably don't have the same faith that somebody who's got nothing. Somebody that's waking up in the morning not knowing where their next meal's coming from, not knowing how they're going to put electricity in their meter, not knowing how they're going to heat their home, not knowing if they're going to be able to buy a new outfit when the one they're wearing gets worn out. But they're trusting God. And I know God makes provision, and I know the job I've got has been provided by God in a sense. I'm not trying to take away from that, but the reality is that maybe it's our need that drives us to trust God and depend on God. And this widow, who was a widow indeed, who was alone, she wasn't alone, was she? Because she trusted God. She trusted God. And not only did she trust God, but she continued in supplications and prayers night and day. Night and day. So not only was this an individual that had poured herself into the lives of other people in a practical way and invested herself into the needs of the church in a practical way, but this was a woman that knew God, and this was a woman that knew how to supplicate, and this was a woman that knew how to pray night and day, night and day. That's a valuable person to have in any church, isn't it? An individual that's trusting God, and an individual that's supplicating night and day. That's invaluable. That's worth that's worth more than I could count of me standing up here sharing and preaching. To have a wee woman or a wee widowed man who just spends their time night and day supplicating God's throne, praying. There's no greater role to be fulfilled in a local church than that role. Someone in the background that doesn't get seen and doesn't get heard and maybe doesn't get recognised, but they're there night and day, consistently, persistently, praying and supplicating to God. And Paul says that's the type of woman that I'm willing to support. That's the type of person that I'm willing to invest in, because they're investing themselves in the church. And so, relationship, verse 1, this is just for me trying to get back on track here. Respect, verse 1 and 2, responsibility of the church. Verse 3, responsibility of a family. Verse 4, verse 8, verse 16, we've thought a wee bit in verse 9 and verse 10 about the requirements of the widows who were widows indeed in order to get financial support. And then Paul says, doesn't he, in verse 11, just to conclude this little section, there's a refusal to support. Again, it's spiritual discernment, isn't it? Spiritual wisdom. That the church is not just a free-for-all. The church is not just there as a means to meet every need, in a sense. There needs to be discretion. There needs to be wisdom. And so he says, the church has got to refuse. There are people that are going to want their name on this list and want to be supported by the church, but he says that don't put their name on it, refuse it. He says you have to refuse younger widows. These are individuals who, when they've begun to grow wanting against Christ, they'll desire to marry, and so they'll go on and marry again. And I suppose, in a sense, this idea of wanting against Christ is that actually the urge to marry would outgrow their desire for Christ. And so really the thought is this, that they'll get married at any cost and almost to any man in order just to be in that marital relationship again. So it's not even that they'll seek God and seek guidance and marry another believer, but the chances are that such will be their desire to marry again, that they'll just marry anybody, believer or non-believer, in order to be in that marital state. And so Paul says, don't accept them onto your list, because he says when they're wanting against Christ and when their desire for a marital relationship exceeds their desire for Christ, they'll marry again, even if that marriage isn't in the Lord, and they'll marry someone that they shouldn't have married at all. And so they need to be, and again, a little word of warning, isn't it? That as Christians, that we ought to be looking for a partner in life that's a Christian, so that we don't have this unequal yoke together of a Christian and a non-Christian. And so it should be seeking someone in the Lord when we're looking for a partner in life, and don't let our desire to be married drive us to the point where we're just willing to marry anyone, in a sense, for the privilege of a marital relationship. But we need to make sure that the person we marry is the person that God wants us to marry. And so we don't want to be like those widows who would be wanting against Christ and who would just seek marriage for the sake of marriage. So he says they've got condemnation because they've cast off their first faith. They've left Christ and they've chosen to pursue a relationship with someone that they shouldn't have pursued a relationship for someone. Besides this, he says they'll learn to be idle. So he says if you're going to make provision for them financially, he says then they're going to learn just to be lazy. Paul doesn't have any time for lazy people. Paul was a worker. Paul was a faithful minister of Christ, but Paul worked hard with his hands as well, didn't he? You know, Paul was hard. He didn't put his didn't burden other people with his needs. He worked hard and he expected other people to work hard. He says, if you're going to make financial provision for people, if you're just going to encourage them to be lazy and idle, then don't do it. He says they're going to be idle, and he says they're going to go about from house to house. He says, and then what do they do when they've got spare time in their hands? They just become gossipers. They just flit from house to house with other individuals in the same boat, and then they just start talking about other people and gossiping. And so he says, look, he says, these individuals shouldn't go on the list, he says, because they're saying things that they shouldn't say. He says, therefore, he says, his desire is, he says, that the younger widows would marry, only in the Lord, but he says they should marry. He says they should bear children, they should manage their house, and they should give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. He says, for some have already turned aside after Satan. So people had already turned aside. Over the short course of time that Paul knew the believers in Ephesus, there had been women who had found themselves in that position. And rather than stick to their passion for the Lord Jesus Christ, they had fallen away from Christ in their desire to have a marital relationship. And he says they turned aside after Satan. So he says you've got to refuse these individuals. You've got to refuse. So it's about discretion. It's about spiritual wisdom and discretion, not just about meeting every need. And again, you know, you think of the various needs that people maybe come to us about individually, or maybe come to us as a church, and you know, it's about having that spiritual discretion, isn't it? To see if that's a need that we should meet, if it's a need that we can meet, and if there's requirements in their life that they exhibit in order for them to be the benefit of that, to be the recipients of that kindness and that charity. And that's about wisdom, isn't it? That's about discretion. And so Paul says, yeah, there's requirements, and there are people that we will refuse to accept on the list. And then there's a little bit about elders. We'll not touch on that this afternoon. I'm conscious that our time has run over. But for anybody that was following my little list of R's, I'll just go back over it in case you want to write them down. I thought they were pretty good. Relationship, 1 and 2, brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers. We thought a wee bit about the respect, didn't we, that we ought to show to people who are older. And I trust that that's a lesson that we can all take away. Our responsibilities. And again, that's ministry to my own heart, by the way. Before I minister to anybody else's heart, we've got a responsibility as families to take care. There is a responsibility we have as a church, and it's finding out where those lie. We thought a wee bit about the requirements of the widows that were going to be on the list, and then we thought a wee bit about the refusal of Paul to put certain individuals on the list because of their failure to meet the requirements of financial aid from the church. And so there is a chapter, perhaps, as we say, that's maybe not our first choice to look at, but certainly there is lessons for us, isn't there? And I do trust that the time we've spent might have been of a help to us this afternoon. Shall we pray?